We'll move on then to our closing talk today. Our first keynote speaker, Ophelia Deroy, connecting also from Munich, based at the LMU here in Munich, Ludwig Maximilian University, for those who are not familiar with the acronym. She's a colleague, a friend, and I'm very, very honored that she has taken the time today to tell us about social distancing and the social dimensions of social distancing. Over to you, Ophelia. Do you want to share your camera with us so that we can see you and hear you? Just wait for you to switch on your camera as well. We can see you, we can hear you, and I'm just waiting to see your screen share stabilize. Perhaps if you press play now.
Okay. We're here.
Fantastic. We see you, we hear you, we see your slides. Welcome again. And I'm just going to pass over to you and mute myself.
Great. Thanks, Mern, and thanks all the organizers also, Olga and the committee. But I know we are on short timing, so I will start now. And this is actually a sort of theoretical framework, which is a sort of reconstruction of the type of analysis and thinking that took place in our lab and extended group as we started witnessing both the rise of the pandemic and the introduction of social distancing measures. And so this is a sort of theoretical part, and there's an empirical study that is still ongoing, but whose results will be presented later on by Bahar Tungen on behalf of a large group of researchers. But here I want to sort of give you a first introduction to what struck me as one key aspect of the distancing measures very early on. And this is borrowed from a very famous brand of sweets and chocolates, very popular in India, Kiss Me. And they changed their advertising to reflect and promote distancing behavior in the midst of the pandemic, asking people to keep their distance only for a while, changing their usual logo, we can see appear on the top, which was advertising much more proximity, as you can see. Now, what's interesting with this picture and pictorial representation is that I think it reflects quite well what I would call the paradox of distancing. That is the fact that distancing, when it is respected, like between these two characters below, is actually some form of social change and for social benefits that goes against social inclinations. And that's a quite specific case in the norm change literature, on the behavior change literature, because you have a motivation that you need to repress to actually accomplish what this motivation usually accomplishes, that is promote social good and be kind to others. So you need to take your distance in order to be kind. You need to be distant in order to stay close. This is the sort of paradoxical incentive that makes, I think, the analysis and the hypothesis that we can have about distance is quite unique in the normative social norm literature. Because now it seems that we are pulled between promoting social benefits, the health of the greater number, while having to be anti or less social. In this respect, I want to show how thinking about distancing in this way changes how we should consider, analyze the concept of non-distancing behavior, but also changes our thinking about which interventions should be promoted. So why does it change the conceptualization of norm violations, which most people have focused on? That is why not everybody has started to distantiate if this is the rational and reasonable thing to do. Well, the first thing I want to stress here is, again, having to do with a more conceptual point, is that we should accept that everybody is a norm violator to some respect. That is, the norm of ideal distancing, of keeping 2 meters apart from everyone at every time, is never something that a normal, an actual agent can respect. There will be always a point in which you will have some external constraints or some distraction and will not respect it. So in that sense, I think the normative ideal is not just that it kept changing, but everyone has been doing less. I put in brackets the exception of some people doing too much. That is also, I think we're not paying enough attention of the extra norm enforcers, people who have decided to really hide themselves and not even come close to anyone. And I think this is an important set of population to attend to. But basically, there is no ideal distancer. So the terminology that I think is clearer here is to talk about people who are under distancers, people who haven't followed the ideal, or not all the time. And I say there's this category of over distancers. Also on this category, we can have people who have not only distantiated themselves more, but felt that they had themselves to enforce the norm upon others. So there are these hyper distancers and signalers, which are also interesting. Now, when we have this, we need to think about this large population of people who haven't followed the ideal distances, a bit, I think, relative to an Anna Karenina principle. That is, there will be much more similarities between people who have done better, whereas people who have done very badly and haven't distantiated or kept social distancing very strictly will be very different. I put a question mark, of course, because that's a sort of analytical point rather than an empirical one. The reason to think that the non-distancer and under-distancers will follow this Anna Karenina principle has to do with the variety of factors that will predict the compliance with distancing, ranging from your own individual vulnerability, whether you think actually there is a real threat, whether the virus is real, or whether it's a political conspiracy, we've heard about that, and whether you also think that the recommendations are good recommendations. So both factual and normative beliefs will play a very important role, and who passes these beliefs on, and so on and so forth. But beside individual factors, there's been a lot of accent on the social structural factors, which range from your access to health system, to whether you're employed, and what other sort of social support is provided in your country or your small local community. And they're the more subjective dispositions, whether you're inclined to actually follow what others say, or whether you actually have to care for other people. So your own subjective factors will play a role. In that sense, these two things have also themselves been affected during the pandemic. So social structural factors like employment or wealth or access to healthcare have varied during the pandemic, or be suddenly put under a lot of uncertainty. Your social inclinations also could have varied differently in the midst of the pandemic. It could be, for instance, that you were not very socially close to people, and then you had to look after themselves, which has changed your subjective closeness to various people. In a nutshell, beside these subjective inclinations, you can think that people's social network has also been an important factor, and changes to this social network as well. All of these factors, starting from the individual ones, your vulnerability, to the size of your network, or how socially inclined and oriented you are, will create different pools of incentive to actually diverge or comply with distancing. Just to give you a very quick example, we can think that there are two types of under-distancers. One who will, for instance, have a low vulnerability, be a young person, for instance, be very convinced that the virus is real, but have a relatively small network and have a very strong access to healthcare, for instance. Whereas another under-distancer could be a highly vulnerable, but who doesn't really think that the virus is real, and differ also with respect to his network and not having access to healthcare or the access being difficult. So making any generalizations on norm violations or not following distancing perfectly will be therefore very problematic. But to come back to more possibly theoretical and conceptual points here, what we have to think about first and foremost when talking about this non-respect of distancing is which norm is eventually violated. And here, the talk of the new normal, I think, has convinced everybody that distancing is a norm or needs to be conceptualized as a norm. And I'm becoming more and more skeptical that this is actually a single construct or even the right one. Borrowing from Christina's Bicchieri analysis on what social norms are, we can distinguish between rules that are applied independently of others and rules which are applied only conditionally on whether others actually also are involved in this rule following. On the one hand, you can follow a rule just because you need to follow it. That's what is called a custom. It could be that distancing is a new custom in that respect. It could be also that by yourself, you just believe that this is the right thing to do, and that would be a norm of falling into the moral norm, something you do for out of your own deontology. This is right and appropriate. But if you go on the other side and the rules that are applied only because they become shared at the collective level, we have also to distinguish between what Bicchieri suggests to call descriptive norms, that is just everybody starts to do it, therefore I will follow. It's just based on empirical expectations, observations, real factual observations of other distancing, and we adopt a descriptive norm. What she suggests is talking of a new social norm would require not only that people see that the norm is applied by others and expect others to follow it on descriptive terms, but also that we think that we as a collective endorse the norm as the right one. In this respect, I hope to convince you that when we look at distancing, at least surely it's not yet a stable social norm. It's not true that everybody is empirically following it or that everybody is actually accepting it as a new norm. If only many people, like in the advertising I started with, only see it not as or accept it as normal and appropriate, but see as a very temporary, frustrating social tool. And many others see it as mostly a legal norm. In a nutshell, we might consider it as best as a descriptive norm, but talking about it as a social norm per se or established, I think is not yet the case. Therefore, the under-distancers that I think are the vast majority are not so much norm violators as people who are resistant to a change in rules of behavior, and that can be eventually conceptualized as a norm change, but depends on which norm we're talking about as well. So in this framework, we can also use this reconceptualization to think a bit better about the hypotheses that explain resistance to what could be conceptualized as uncertain stabilization of a new social norm, but I've explained why I have doubts about whether this conceptualization is actually so straightforward. Anyway, if we want to select the hypothesis for resisting the social norm, then we shouldn't just look at reasons to resist things as custom. I think the fact that there are many people who said that people don't apply distancing because basically they don't feel any vulnerability at the individual level. So if something is not meeting a need, it's not that people are violating what they see as a social norm, they just don't follow a custom. If they don't believe they have the need, so it's maybe that they feel non-vulnerable, although they are, the same thing follows. It might be also that what is violated needs to be more conceptualized as a moral norm because people don't believe actually that distancing or this type of measures are appropriate. But switching from the individual level to the social level, what seems to be at stake if we start to conceptualize this as a problem at the level of the collective, so social distancing as a social phenomena, it might be that what is at stake is a problem with social beliefs, which we expect others are doing, but also more appropriateness conditions, what we think people think is appropriate to do. So we are not just failing to coordinate our expectations in terms of facts, but also in terms of values. This connects to a set of hypotheses that explain why maybe this lack of normative alignment at the social level happens, which have been widely shared, at least on at the beginning of the pandemic and continue to be, which fall under what we've suggested in a recent article to call Neooption views. So Hobbes is famous in the Leviathan for saying that when the state disappears or when war happens, then everything is degraded and our violent instincts surface again, and the life of man, quote, becomes solitary, poor, nasty, British, and short. In the same aspect, many people have started thinking that in the face of the pandemic, or selfish inclinations, which are the default inclinations, the fact that we'll care about ourselves only, will actually be revealed or expressed more. These neo-option views, for sure, and I think this is an open question for investigation, have had a very wide appeal. People seem to like to tweet and report with this neo-option framework. So a few examples of popular tweets and hashtag. There's been an over-reporting of violations in the media as well, right from the beginning of people storing water to now people not respecting distancing and pictures of crowds. But I think this reflects actually an option bias on the estimation of the proportion of such violations and also on how irrational or bad they're supposed to be. There are various problems with these neo-option views. The problem is, as I said, they tend to misrepresent the quantity of such self-interested, selfish behaviors, but also they seem to be conceptually or theoretically a non-starter for cognitive neuroscientists and psychologists, because as we defended in a recent article with colleagues Guillaume de Zocache and Chris Friss, it's not true that our default nature is actually to be self-interested and selfish. There are good evolutionary reasons and cognitive models showing that actually our default response is to be collaborative and socially supportive. Now, it's true that if we have good evidence of this being the default, we still can think that this default mode has been totally shattered by the pandemic and the approaching threat of the virus and various uncertainties. So that could suffice to turn us into antisocial beings. So that's another way in which someone could choose to be neo-options, give up the idea that we are selfish by default, except we're social by default, but still think we have been turned into antisocial creatures by the approaching threat of the pandemic. Now, following some other social hypothesis, and this is very much drawing on discussion that happened very early on in the pandemic with colleague Guillaume de Zocache from Clermont-Ferrand. The idea was to say that actually in even the worst scenarios that we know of and that Guillaume had been working on, people actually show that social support continues to be the preferred solution. This was based on, for instance, just an illustration of the work of Guillaume, who interviewed survivors for mass shooting in the Bataclan and showed that actually, at least on reports, people reported that they were socially supportive more often than they behaved in a selfish way. And there was cross over between testimonies that seems to suggest this was true, and actually social support was enhanced in the front of disaster. What we've tried to do is actually to distinguish two kinds of social hypotheses to apply it more finely to the case of the pandemic. There is on the one hand what we can call the hypersociality thesis or hypothesis, which has been developed by the likes of Bex and Cohn already, That is the fact that, and many others, the fact that we're hypersocial beings, and that this sociality constitutes our psychological baseline. We seek social closeness in the guise of touch, proximity. We also seek social reciprocity, so we need give and take interactions to feel psychologically balanced. And any divergence from this baseline will actually encourage us to seek and compensate by seeking more contact and proximity with others. Now, we want to distinguish this from a sort of other aspect, which would be the extrasociality hypothesis, which is that if the contact and support thinking are heightened by specifically feelings of threat and anxiety accompanying the approach of threat, then we'll observe even more tendency to rebalance. So the hypersociality is a description of the baseline and the momentum that brings us back to this baseline. What we want to say is that this divergence and returns tend to be heightened in the face of threat and the pandemic. There's of course the combination of virus-induced anxiety, but eventually there is also the anxiety which is induced by the fact that we have been disconnected from our close social support and the regular reciprocal interactions, touch, contact, co-presence events that we're used to. So that's, I think, a way in which we can frame the specific idea that there is in a way extrasociality being offered as a response on top and over and above the hypersociality that we know of. That helps us reframe the paradox of distancing in that respect, and bracketing the fact that, as I said, there are many social and individual factors that need to be taken into account. We can hypothesize that much of the resistance to distancing is actually because we're hyper and extra social in these circumstances. I will conclude in the next few minutes on a few consequences, I think, that can already be drawn for rethinking interventions. On the first part, we've seen communications and policies wrongly focusing on under distancing as a norm violation. I think we need to see that these little drawings that appear everywhere on our billboards and screens represent an ideal agent that will not talk to most of the public. There's been mostly non-ideal under or over distancer, and it's not clear exactly which norm is being violated, and this might depend on how people represent the problem in the first instance. The second circumstance that many interventions, like the one that we see on the right again, have targeted the individual construal and the individual scale, seeing that the person to convince is a single individual, and playing on individual factors within that agent by trying to change their belief about their vulnerability or changing their approval of a certain policy, distancing rules. What remains to be done is to try and target the control of new rules of behavior as a collective problem, as a thing that engages we in the appropriate way, but also tap into the social motivations and social psychological drives in the individual. Of course, here we can think about classic nudges being offered as a key response. I can try, for instance, to convince people that distancing is observed by 75% of the population, to change your expectations about this new descriptive norm being followed and making you follow it more. But what we've been tapping into are more social psychological factors that could help with construing the problem as a collective problem, and looking at aspects such as social influence, which Bahar will be talking about later, but also aspects such as collective responsibility and social trust that other people in the group are currently looking at with our data. And on this, I will conclude by thanking my two co-authors on the first theoretical reflections that I presented, and some of the people who have contributed to the empirical project that will be presented later. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Ophelia. I'm sure that that was incredibly stimulating, not just for me, but for everybody listening in. And as a result, we do in fact have quite a few people with questions. Domina, you're welcome to put yourself on the screen and you can ask your question. I know it's the most recent one, but why don't we start with you?
Hi, Ophelia. Thank you very much for your talk. Very interesting, as always. Yes, it was a question to you, but always as well to the rest of the group watching us. So my question was, like, social distancing has been really followed in the past during other pandemics, right? They had to do it, but now people perceive it as something new. Then it's going to end up being the new norm. Everybody talks about it, and why is that? Do the media have to play any role in it, or how likely do you think we are to forget it in the next year or so?
So the analysis of the memories will be, I think, as you say, you know, whether people will remember and how they will remember distancing will be very interesting. I'm not sure that until we know for how long we will have to practice it, that I can offer, you know, if it's that brief and it was a single instance or it lasts for 5 years, that we have to practice it or return to it will be very different in terms of the impact on the memory. The tradition is a very fair point that in some places, the idea of responding to epidemics, if not pandemics, is much more prominent. And some rules were already available in the culture and tradition. I'm not aware of any data speaking yet to possible differences and whether acceptability has been influenced by this factor. But I think it would fit quite neatly into the idea that maybe something is more accepted as a moral norm or social norm because people already have instances where this was recognized as the appropriate thing to do. Whereas for other people now it's totally new. It's not clear that this was part of what we think is the right thing to do. And therefore, at best, we are taking it more as a descriptive norm. I think that's what I would suggest.
Thank you.
So I really like that that distinction in terminology, because at one point you also talked about the resistance to change in norms. And maybe then again, we need to be more specific when we talk about resistance to change in collective norms, in individual norms, and so on. So do you have maybe something more to say on this idea that we are probably adaptively set up to be resistant to fluctuations around us, and how that then impinges or changes the way we first adapt our norms and then change our behavior accordingly?
Yeah, I think that in the last slides, I was trying to point at the work that, for instance, people like Christina Bicchieri have done in terms of looking at changes in social norm, tend to show that social motives are stronger, but also that it's not because every individual feels that the norm will benefit them or that this is the right thing to do that the changeless norm happen distributed over many individuals. It tends to be because the problem of norm change is construed as a collective problem that it happens. And the second thing that work on norm changes as shown in the past is that our tendency to see others respecting the norm are stronger than seeing or hearing them approving of the norm. So if people say distancing is great, but nobody is really practicing it, that will be a problem with the compliance to the norm. And Bahar will present some data speaking to this. What I still wanted to qualify is that I think there is some caution that needs to be exercised when we take this hypothesis about norm changes in other contexts and the actual situation, because a lot of these norm changes didn't imply that people had to go against their social inclination and their social needs. And so we are really, I was trying to capture what I think makes the current cases a very important place to test hypothesis in this theory-driven way, because we have this hypothesis about how norm changes occurs in other contexts. but not in cases where our social drives are really antagonistic with what is required of us.
I mean, I think that you're sort of talking about two vectors and being very clear what those two vectors are to see whether or not there is in fact a change or not. And I think that's an invaluable distinction. On a point that you mentioned a few seconds ago, we have Rachel Sumner, who presented earlier today, who says the issue of the overrepresentation of violation in the media is a huge problem. And you suggested, you know, if you're seeing people conform to regulations, to social distancing rules, it's going to push us in one direction. But if we see, as the media likes to focus on perhaps on the exceptions, perhaps they aren't exceptions, but this over focus on the violation may have some negative effects. Do you have anything to say in that regard?
Yes, glad to hear shared view, but the overrepresentation, I think, is one aspect of the problem in the media. The second will be the fact that nobody can be the ideal that the positive messaging is presenting. And I think that unless you put a barrier around yourself with 2 meters distance, nobody can 100% of the time, if they go out, keep 2 meters away from people. This is not a rule. That what is being offered on these panels is just an impossible norm to follow in its determined form. And of course, what has been privileged is the clear messaging. That is, I give you this idea that there should be always a sofa between you and others. But we've seen many people who absolutely think that this is the right thing to do. So they have adopted it as a new deontology. They believe this is the right norm, but they just do not in practice implement it just because it's impossible to do. When you're in a supermarket, you might be 2 meters away from the person in front, but not on your left and your right. And we've seen many of such examples. So should we construe these people as norm violators? Are they ignorant? Are they actually just doing their best? Or, you know, where do we see the fault already? So I would add to that point that beside the overrepresentation of the bad guys who are explicitly and seemingly consciously violating a norm because they refuse to follow it, we have many people who have accepted the norm and are seen also not following it for various reasons. So that's a double problem.
Well, we'll be hearing more about the influence of media and, in fact, social media in the coming days. We do also have another comment by Baha, who will be presenting a lot of this data, as you mentioned, tomorrow. And she suggests, could common underlying characteristics define those resisting norm change? And conspiracy theorists, obviously drawing a nice link to the talk we just had. Do you have any thoughts on that point?
So conspiracy theorists, obviously because of this terminology, maybe some factors that need to be distinguished between the construing them at the individual and social level. So you might be this conspiracy theorist because of your own personal, subjective, psychological factors, but you might also find yourself being a conspiracy theorist because of social influence. So and seeing yourself as a member of people who share this skepticism. So I think there's some of the factors, obviously, that will not fall neatly between whether this is to be construed as an individual or a social factor. This is part of the discussion that we have at the moment in order to parse some of our data, because they don't sometimes really divide neatly between, or at least we don't have the means to say whether it's this behavior or decisions or reports we have to be understood as individual or socially determined. I don't know whether that's shared also.
No, absolutely. I think that's very much on point. And a final question comes from Gerrit Pohl, who also gave a wonderful talk today, who highlights the influence of culture. So we've talked about individual norms and social norms, but obviously there are also these other umbrellas, cultures. We spoke to Lexi in New York, who even suggested, we discussed the fact that those umbrellas may be from coast to coast within the same country or north to south in others. Gerrit says it depends on culture. In Northern Europe, social distancing is easy. Handshaking is not as common. And so maybe watching our political leaders at the most recent summit elbowing is not that big a change, because for most of them, it's an easy shift. So not only the vector is important, but the distance that I have to go from where I am today versus what the new regulations tell me to do, it needs to be considered.
Absolutely. I'm trying to speak this, I guess the terminological and conceptual differences across field are very important to take into account. Where I was probably pushing this to generally in the social structural factors that are, have to do with the demographics, the socioeconomic status. But of course, it's a fair pointer to say there might be also cultural representation. Maybe this is what Domna also was suggesting, the existence of traditions and so on and so forth, which I would still think fall into an umbrella that is a different category of social dimensions of social distancing from how socially oriented or socially disposed or socially influenceable we are psychologically. So I was trying to parse between this dimension that we can construe more as social psychology versus more social facts that we can actually measure independently.
Yeah, I think basically it's just leads me to a final question where I don't even know if there is an answer to this, but we saw obviously in Huiba's data, but also various others today, that we've all been trying to grapple with this data in a very short amount of time. And what we're seeing is that we have so many variables that we're trying to control for, that we end up with these extremely complex models. I think this is a question that I'd like everybody to think on. It's sort of homework, as it were. What to do with this data? So methodologically speaking, are we doing the right thing, trying to control for everything and having these complex models that might be harder to make sense of later on? And maybe that's something Baha can tell us about, because she has been hands-on this data, as it were, but some homework. And I don't know if you have some thoughts on this.
No, I think that's the decisions to try and control things were taken obviously very early on, and then there is a commitment to continue collecting the data for a while with this, even as our thinking was evolving. At the moment, I think that some early clarifications have proven quite robust in our data, so we're quite happy about that. But exactly the problems that you described regarding a lot of unplanned data models, hypotheses have cropped in. So we're in this kind of divided, and a lot of our current discussions have to do with this methodological issues, that what is the right thing to do with the things we hadn't anticipated or we decided to do and realized 2 weeks after we would have done differently. So.
Yeah, it's how we've had to work in this new and interesting post-COVID world. So I will, as there's no more questions, I don't know if you have another question, Domna, but otherwise it just leaves me to thank you so much, Ophelia, for joining us from Munich, so not too far away, but for sharing with us this more theoretical take on the problems that we need to solve, especially when looking at our data. And so that goes hand in hand with the homework I've given you all. And I hope very much to see many, if not all, and more tomorrow for our continued program, which will start at 10 a.m. CET, so that's German time. Happy to do some conversions for you if you drop me an email. Otherwise, thank you to all our speakers today, to our various chairs who took over from me for a little while, and to Olga and Yasmin, and to everybody who's been involved in getting this up and running, and it's run as smoothly as anyone could want. Thank you again, Ophelia, and I wish you all a very pleasant evening. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow.
Thanks, everybody. See you tomorrow.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
So much.